Thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you for your patience. This is part of our Brown Bag lecture series, and today we're lucky enough to have Anya Jabour. She's going to be talking about the relationship between women's rights and racial justice in the United States. Anya is a professor of history and the co-director of the Women's and Gender Studies program at the UM. She teaches courses in U.S. women's history and is currently working on a book about a 20th century social justice activist and a social work professor, Sophonisba Breckenridge. Hope I did that right. So everyone, let's give her a round of applause and welcome Anya.
Hi. Okay, so when Miranda contacted me and asked me to do this, and asked me to come up with a subject, what I thought that I would do is, yes, that is what I want to do. Okay, so I'm just going to talk. Okay, so to begin again. So when Miranda asked me to talk to this group, I suggested that what I could do was talk about the relationship between movements for women's rights and movements for racial justice, and the ways in which, although those movements have historically been very closely intertwined in the United States, there have also been a lot of tensions that have sort of created fractures and often have ended up separating white and black activists, in particular white and black women, and requiring the folks who are active in a movement that initially brought those folks together to kind of choose, to prioritize, right? Am I female first, or am I black first, or whatever the racial or ethnic group might be, and then sort of breaking down on those lines rather than forming common cause. Okay? And we see this sort of pattern happening over and over again in the United States, where women will, black and white women, will join a movement that's originally for racial justice. In the course of that work, they gain the tools that they need in order to run a grassroots movement. So they gain organizing abilities. They also encounter obstacles within the movement, barriers because of their gender, and they therefore begin to sort of become more aware, right, of the ways in which their gender is preventing them from being good advocates for racial justice. And then moreover, they also get kind of a language in which to understand their own oppression. So in the course of analyzing racial injustice, they also become conversant with being able to analyze sex discrimination, right? And then that sort of leads them to tackle that problem as well. And that, well, typically, sort of what's happened in the past is that that means that they've sort of gone racial justice and women's rights, and then there's that split moment where if they're white, they usually pick women, and if they're not, they usually pick the other group, right? And then the coalition kind of falls apart until the next wave of activism, right? So just as we talk about kind of waves of feminism, the first wave, the suffrage movement, the second wave, the women's liberation movement, and, oh, look, it's back. And, thank you, and the third wave of the present day with respect to feminism, kind of the same thing happens with respect to the way that feminism intersects with racial justice movements. And you can kind of, the waves don't precisely co-align. The racial justice one starts first, and then building out of it comes the women one. And then they both kind of go, and then it happens again. And then it happens again, right? Okay, so the first group in this country to attempt to work simultaneously on issues of racial justice and women's rights were the abolitionist feminists, women who were simultaneously working to abolish the race-based institution of slavery and to advance women's rights. One of their motivations for joining the abolitionist movement in the first place was that they had a very strong sense of sisterhood. The abolitionist movement in general capitalized on the idea that all humans were sort of, related in, right, kind of the brotherhood of man, right? And British abolitionists, who were mostly men, had this abolitionist motif: am I not a man and a brother, right? So if we're all brothers under our skins, we should all feel a common cause, right? Women abolitionists in the United States adapted that motif and created their own version of the motto, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" Right? And so one of their primary motivations for joining this movement was the sense that even though, you know, there is an awful lot separating the life of a middle-class white matron living in Boston in the 1830s, right, from an enslaved African-American woman working in the cotton fields of Alabama at the same time. I mean, these are very distinctive, very different experiences, and yet the feminist abolitionists said, we're still both women, and we are therefore sisters, and we owe it to our sisters to free them from their bondage. Right. Some other motivations for joining that movement were the specific dangers that slavery posed to women that it did not pose to men, at least to the same degree. Right? And one of those was the dangers to women's control over their own bodies and the ways in which slave women were particularly vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Another was that the abolitionist feminists could identify with slave women in their capacity as mothers. And in the decades leading up to the Civil War, the antebellum era, as it's called, the sort of prevailing notions of ideal womanhood really idealized motherhood as well and placed a very high premium on the mother-child bond. So the fact that slavery, because slaves were property and could be bought and sold at sort of the caprice or out of the financial necessity of an owner, and that could separate mothers and children, as well as, you know, siblings and fathers and children and so forth. But the danger to slave families then was also of particular concern to these abolitionist feminists. Any questions so far? Okay, I talk really fast, so if you want me to repeat anything, let me know. Okay, so again, as I said, one of the things that women gained in the course of working on behalf of racial justice was a language in which to understand their own oppression. And during this kind of first wave of abolitionism, feminism, what they tended to talk about was what they called the slavery of sex, right? So they drew these parallels between the rights that were denied enslaved African Americans and the rights that were denied American women, particularly American wives, right? So slaves were actually property. Wives were not actually property, but their labor was their husband's property, right? Slaves' children automatically, slave women's children automatically became enslaved. That is, they became the property of the white male head of household. White women, likewise, had no legal claim to custody of their own children. A child without a father was an orphan, right? So again, that was another parallel. Slaves, of course, being property themselves, could not own property, at least not technically. In fact, they frequently did, but that's a whole different lecture. Wives, likewise, if they did earn an income by performing work for pay, that income automatically became the property of their husbands, right? So in all those ways, then, there were these kind of parallels between the situation of women, particularly married women, and the situation of American slaves. And for these reasons, then, abolitionist feminists suggested that it really made sense to join these causes. Angelina Grimke, who was an abolitionist feminist from South Carolina, she actually had to flee her native town because she and her sister were burned in effigy for speaking out in public against slavery. Very exciting, dramatic story. Anyway, Angelina Grimke said, "The rights of the slave and of woman blend like the colors of the rainbow." Antoinette Brown, who was another early abolitionist feminist, this one, she's a Northerner, who went to my alma mater, Oberlin College, said, "The wife owes service and labor to the husband as much and as absolutely as a slave does to his master." And again, because women frequently encountered opposition, when they spoke in public, that was considered extremely inappropriate for women. And in particular, if they spoke in public before mixed gender gatherings, that was very unacceptable. People refer to it as speaking before a promiscuous audience, right? Suggesting that somehow women who spoke in public were like disrobing themselves, right, of their womanhood, and not just engaging in intellectual discourse, but in sexual intercourse with their audience members. So it was very scandalous. Therefore, that's what Abby Kelly Foster was getting at when she said, "In striving to strike the slaves' irons off, we found most surely that we were manacled ourselves." Abby Kelly Foster is a fascinating character on many fronts, one of which is that she was one of the earliest tax protesters. She and her husband refused to pay any of their taxes because their taxes supported slavery. Okay, so jumping forward to 1840, in 1840, U.S. abolitionists and British abolitionists met together in London at the World Anti-Slavery Convention. Now, although by this point, the U.S. abolitionists had accepted women's full participation in the movement, and women in the American movement were working as editors, as speakers, as writers, as leaders, right, of the movement. The British movement was still very male-dominated. And originally the female delegates who were sent by the American group were refused admission to the hall where the convention was taking place. Then eventually they were allowed in, but they had to sit separately from the men upstairs in a balcony. At that conference then, two people had a very fortuitous meeting, and they were the Philadelphia Quaker Lucretia Coffin Mott, who was one of the earliest abolitionists, and a younger abolitionist woman who was actually there on her honeymoon with her husband, who was at the time also an abolitionist, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And these two met and they had this conversation and said, "Gosh, here we are having this convention about rights for enslaved African Americans. Wouldn't it be cool if we did something like this for women?" Right? That's the sort of the genesis. Ultimately, that resulted in the first women's rights convention in the United States at Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. Why Seneca Falls? Because that's where Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived. Why 8 years between the World Anti-Slavery Convention and the convention at Seneca Falls? Because Elizabeth Cady Stanton had 7 children in that time. Also pictured here is Susan B. Anthony, who, although she joined this movement a bit later, would eventually become Elizabeth Cady Stanton's closest colleague. And in many ways also, as Cady Stanton and her husband grew increasingly apart, Susan B. Anthony also became Elizabeth Cady Stanton's most important sort of emotional connection. The growing apart had a lot to do with the 7 children. Yes, Cindy?
I was just wondering about that word sentiments. It's always struck me as a kind of soft word rather than like Declaration of Human Rights or something like that. So was it used differently in those times, or was it?
That's a really good question. So it's actually borrowed from the abolitionist movement. That's where they got it. So the American Anti-Slavery Society, their founding document, what we would call a constitution, right, was the Declaration of Sentiments and Purposes. And Lucretia Coffin Mott actually wrote it, but then she wasn't allowed to sign it because she was a woman. That was in the early days before the Americans granted women full access to the movement. So Declaration of Sentiments is a kind of a short form of that. In terms of the language itself, however, I mean the language actually in the Declaration, it's very much modeled on the Declaration of Independence, right? I mean, just through and through and through. So much so, in fact, that long before I knew that there was any such thing as women's history, when I was in 5th grade and we all had to memorize the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, I thought I was being very clever and original in modifying it to say that all human beings, male and female, are created equal. And then, you know, like 10 or 15 years later, when I was in college and took my first women's history class, I was like, oh, I guess I wasn't so original after all. But I mean, that's how closely they are. So, so part of this reads, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And then it goes on, just as the Declaration of Independence says, to say that just as Great Britain had denied rights to American colonists, American men are now denying rights to American women. And just as the situation between the American colonies and Great Britain justified a revolution, so does the relationship between American men and women, right? Such has been the patient sufferance of the women under this government, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to demand the equal station to which they are entitled. So, the Declaration of Seneca Falls in some ways created a blueprint for women's rights for, well, we'll see how long, up to now, and yet still. So the 300 women, and I can't remember now if it's 40 or 60 men, but some abolitionist men were there too, demanded equal access to higher education, equal access to the professions, equal pay for equal work. Anyone know the year of that legislation in this country? 1960. This is 1848. Control over their own bodies. Leadership roles in churches. Protection from domestic abuse. Property rights for married women. Less restrictive divorce laws. A public recognition, I love this one, a public recognition of women's right and ability to live independently of men. And finally, most controversially at the time, women's suffrage, the right to vote, the right to the franchise, right? And even though women's suffrage was the most controversial, or maybe because it was the most controversial, that emerged as the focal point for this first wave of American feminism. So here you can kind of see the women's movement then coming out of the racial justice movement, right? Okay, I hope. Okay, now's when it starts falling apart. So for like 30 years, abolitionists and feminists worked side by side, working to enfranchise American women and emancipate African Americans. And then the Civil War happened, and many longtime activists thought that this was their moment, right? They were going to get both of these things. And they were wrong. Right? So what ended up happening is that the Civil War freed African American slaves, did not address women's status at all, and that the Reconstruction Amendments ended slavery and allowed African American men the right to vote, as pictured here, but did not extend voting rights to women. And in fact, for the first time inserted in the Constitution, language defining voting as a right of, quote, male citizens, unquote. The first time the word male was used in the Constitution as a qualification for voting. Granted, that's what all the states had always done, but it wasn't actually in the Constitution until then. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was furious. She said, if once that word male is in the Constitution, it will take us 100 years to get it out. It didn't take quite that long, but you see her point. And so there was this huge debate then among the abolitionist feminists who were forced to decide if they were going to support the Reconstruction Amendments, which helped African American men, but left out women, or if they were going to refuse to support the Reconstruction Amendments because they prioritized men over women and blacks over women. The vast majority of former abolitionists, male and female, as well as Republican politicians, who of course are the ones actually passing the laws, right, said that basically only one group at a time, and this hour is, as they said, the Negro's hour. Women have to wait. Now, in this whole debate, very few people seem to notice that there were people who were simultaneously African American and female. And again, this is what I was getting at the beginning about how this resurfaces again and again as a kind of tension in the connections between racial justice movements and women's rights movements, is that historically, while they see the connection, then there comes this kind of critical point where advocates are forced to prioritize one over the other. And that's what happens here. And black women just sort of get forgotten. One of the people who called attention to this blind spot, if you will, was an African American woman, the former slave from New York, and famous abolitionist and feminist speaker, Sojourner Truth. She predicted that if black men got the vote and black women did not, then she said, the men will be masters over the women, and it will be just as bad as it was before. In other words, a slavery based on race, said Truth, would simply be replaced by a slavery based on sex. Again, that was not the argument that carried the day, right? And ultimately, the debates over the Negro's hour split the abolitionist feminist consensus. The vast majority of women's rights activists, like Abby Kelly Foster, supported African American suffrage and agreed to support the 15th Amendment, saying things like half a loaf is better than none, right? And they formed an organization called the American Woman Suffrage Association, which worked state by state to achieve women's suffrage. A few women's rights activists stubbornly refused to accept this notion, and they were led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Again, this is Stanton's quote, "If that word male be inserted, it will take us a century at least to get it out." And they formed a rival association, the National American Woman, or sorry, it should just say National Woman Suffrage Association. And they pursued federal action to achieve suffrage. But frankly, neither of them accomplished very much. And this is in 1870. I'm going to skip these next couple. Oh, no, well. So again, although most abolitionist feminists picked slaves over women, those who did not became increasingly likely to use racist arguments in support of women's suffrage. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in particular, in this period, really started expressing a lot of very prejudicial statements about, you know, all of these other sort of, the clear implication here is lesser people get to vote, and why don't white educated women like her get to vote, right? So she said, so long as there is a disfranchised class in this country, and that class is women, a man's government is worse than a white man's government, with suffrage limited by property and educational qualifications. Because in proportion as you multiply the rulers, the condition of the politically estranged is more hopeless and degraded. Now, up to there, this all makes very good sense. I mean, her point here, right, is that whereas prior to 1830, voting had not only been restricted to men, but to men of property, men who were heads of household. It was definitely a man's government, but more specifically, it was a government of white male heads of household, right? Poor men, black men, young men, etc., were all left out. Now, all men, not Native Americans, but all American men who were also citizens, had the vote. And so there were more rulers, right? But again, this sort of led her to increasingly racist statements like, "It is an open, deliberate insult to American womanhood to be cast down under the iron-heeled peasantry of the old world and the slaves of the new." So immigrants and blacks have the right to vote before white women, native-born women. So after 20 years of bitter division and pretty much no progress, the two groups rejoined in 1890 as the National American Woman Suffrage Association, but kind of still continued to not be terribly successful until Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were succeeded in their leadership of that organization. Moreover, NASA, even though it's made up of the remnants of abolitionists, right, this organization did not permit African American women to join. So one of the limitations of the organization, besides the fact that it wasn't getting anywhere, was that it did not tap into the support of African American women. This is a picture of Mary Church Terrell, who also was a graduate of my alma mater, Oberlin College. She was a very prominent clubwoman, educator, speaker. She criticized the organization, mainstream suffrage organizations' racism, and promoted what she called racial uplift or black self-help, right? Hoping that as African Americans, and in particular African American women, demonstrated their capacity to be responsible citizens, eventually white people in power would acknowledge that. Even though they did so in separate organizations, both black and white women did participate in the suffrage movement, and in the 1910s, they began to adopt increasingly militant tactics, such as the suffrage parade, right, pictured here. And then, of course, more famously, the picketing the White House during World War I, being jailed, and then going on hunger strike, right? So how many of you have seen the HBO docudrama Iron-Jawed Angels? Yeah, that. Just so you know, it's a docudrama, it's not a documentary. But it gives you an idea. Okay. And ultimately, when the 19th Amendment was adopted in 1920, it did include both black and white women. But it was a struggle. It was a question. I mean, it was an open question whether or not the suffrage amendment was going to have a rider, which is kind of like a postscript to a bill, right, that said, oh, but by the way, not black women. It ultimately did, but not because they were working together terribly effectively. Okay. Any questions? First wave? Yes?
And of course, Jeanette Rankin was in the Congress and voted against the First World War.
Yes. Yes.
So there was a variety of states, mostly Western, that had given the women the vote. And my understanding is that Utah was first, interestingly.
I think Wyoming was actually first. But yes, you're absolutely right. And in fact, we break here for a brief mention of another exciting thing going on. So this is the centennial of women's suffrage for the state of Montana. Not for Native American women, but for everyone else. And there are an incredible number of really cool things going on, particularly in Helena and here in Missoula, to commemorate the centennial. So here in Missoula, we're working on a traveling exhibit that will go around the state, as well as an essay contest and an online exhibit through Mansfield Library. And the Montana, those things aren't live yet, they're in development. the Montana Historical Society in Helena's project is already live. It's called Women's History Matters, and it's a blog, and they have 2 posts every week, and I urge you to follow it. It is fantastic. The site is www.montanawomen'shistory.org. Yeah.
And we have one of the women in that group coming to speak in May, Suzette.
Suzette Newsom?
I think so.
Awesome.
Yeah, so she'll be coming to speak about suffrage from that group.
Yeah.
So there's lots of stuff going on around Montana. Okay. So when I talk about the civil rights movement, I sometimes, if I have time, we'll talk about the long civil rights movement, right? So instead of beginning in the 1950s and 1960s with direct action protesting segregation, beginning in the 1880s with protests against the practice of race-based lynchings. So thousands of people were lynched between the 1880s and the 1920s, most of them African Americans, most of them in the South. The black states indicate states where half or more of the victims were black. There were also lynchings in other places, but in western localities, it tended to be intra-racial violence rather than inter-racial violence. And actually out here, it tended to be Asians. Anyway, but to focus on the African American ones, oh no. I have no idea how to go backwards. Okay.
You should be able to hit the back, the left arrow.
Should. Huh? Brilliant. Okay. So the first really persistent, loud, effective voice in the anti-lynching movement was Ida B. Wells, later Ida B. Wells - Barnett. Ida B. Wells was a journalist and a school teacher, the daughter of slaves, and she published a pamphlet, actually several pamphlets, but one of the earliest ones was called Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. So the general justification that was used for lynchings of African American men in the South, leaving aside all those other different kinds of lynchings, was that they supposedly posed a sexual threat to white women. And the sort of usual justification for a lynching, which would be reported in the newspapers and people would be invited to it like, you know, it was a circus, was to say that a white woman had been outraged, meaning raped, by a black man. Wells, by looking at the newspaper reports, mind you, right, that were public, right, counted and figured out that in fact the vast majority of rape victims had never even been accused of rape, much less actually found guilty of rape. She also found that women as well as men were raped, which obviously did not fit the standard line, right? And she argued then that lynching was not actually about protecting the sexual virtue of white women. It was about the dual domination of African Americans and white women. It terrorized blacks by threatening them with violent retribution, and it terrorized white women by encouraging them to think that they needed to rely on white men for protection, right? So that it had this dual purpose, actually, of keeping African Americans and women at the bottom of the social and economic ladder. Also the political ladder, of course, because one of the lynching was one of many factors that meant that African American men did not actually exercise that right to vote for very long. So African American women really led the anti-lynching movement, but some white women also joined it. And one of those who did was a woman from Texas named Jessie Daniel Ames. Another fascinating figure, she was a Methodist. She was a suffragist. And she had been abandoned by her husband, who left her and ran off to Guatemala. So, I mean, some of the personal stories here are incredible. But anyway, so Jessie Daniel Ames drew on her contacts with Methodist churches throughout the state of Texas, and then ultimately throughout the entire South, to create an organization for white women to protest lynching, because they understood, as Ida B. Wells had pointed out, that lynchings actually also operated to oppress women, right? This organization was called the Southern Association of Women to Prevent Lynching, which is a real mouthful. And it coexisted with a whole lot of denominational organizations and committees with names like the Commission on Racial Reconciliation or the Interracial Coalition or something like that, right? That tended to be denominationally based originally. Then they tended to form kind of alliances across denominations. And of course, one of the groups that was caught up in this was, ta-da, the YWCA. Why does the C matter still? Well, it's part of the history. So, for those of you who want to know more, so the YW has a very long history then of interracial cooperation, dating back to the turn of the century, and this sort of religiously motivated movement to promote interracial cooperation and combat lynching. And I can bring this slide back later if you want to copy these things down. The Y operated camps and among other things, right? Originally, those camps were racially segregated. As you can see here, this is the dramatic club of the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA in Washington, D.C. Phyllis Wheatley was a contemporary of Thomas Jefferson's and a brilliant poet. So her name is used in a lot of African American women's groups. Anyway, you can see, obviously, they're all the blacks. It's an all-black group. Here's an all-white group at a campfire. But by the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, Ys, even in the South, this one's from Mississippi, were desegregating their camps, which was a huge challenge to the patterns of segregation, particularly in the southern states. The Y also provided leadership training for these young activists, many of whom then went on to become active in what we usually think of as the civil rights movement, right? With the sit-ins and the marches and the voter registration campaigns and all of that kind of thing. So by the 1950s, not only Y activists, but lots of other activists were beginning to protest against racial segregation, Jim Crow segregation. You can see here that it's an interracial group as well as a co-ed group. Although the civil rights movement was, of course, primarily based in the South, which is where most African Americans lived, during the Freedom Summers of 1964 and 65, hundreds of college students, most of them white, many of them women, came south to work in the voter registration campaigns in the South. This picture is because they were jailed for that. This is in Jackson, Mississippi. Although this picture shows, again, sort of a diverse cast of civil rights actors, right? Typically, in fact, the civil rights movement had very specific racial as well as gender patterns. So black women were often on the front lines, but white women were often relegated to office tasks. To give you a couple of examples of black women on the front lines, and there's zillions more. Rosa Parks, of course, is famous for beginning the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott in the 1950s. Diane Nash did a whole lot of things, but among other things, she went to jail for registering black voters. I believe also in Alabama. Yeah, it was in Selma. But white women often were sort of kept out of the field work, is what it was called, for the people who went door to door registering people to vote and that kind of thing, right? They were kept out of the field work and instead were restricted to office tasks, or in the South, civil rights workers would rent houses if they could, because nobody would rent to these radical outside agitators, you know. Anyway, but they would rent these houses called freedom houses. And the white women would get assigned to do all the housework and cooking. And everyone else went door to door. Which meant, of course, that the white women did not encounter the same degree of danger, physical danger, as the field workers, but, you know, that they went there to do that, and they weren't being allowed to. So, by the mid-1960s, women in the civil rights movement, mostly the white ones, the ones who were being excluded from field work, right, began to develop a critique of sexism within the movement itself. And that word, sexism, was actually coined in this context because by this point, civil rights activists were using the term racism, and so the women adapted it to be sexism, right? So that's where that term actually comes from. So the two women who penned this very famous memo on women in the movement complained that women are the crucial factor that keeps the movement running on a day-to-day basis, yet they are not given equal say-so when it comes to day-to-day decision-making. Again, they compared sex discrimination to race discrimination. Once again, just as the abolitionists had used the language of the slavery of sex to talk about their own oppression, now this wave of women is using ideas borrowed from the civil rights movement to talk about women's oppression. And also they drew parallels between these things, saying assumptions of male superiority are as widespread and deep-rooted and every much as crippling to the woman as the assumptions of white supremacy are to the Negro. Great point, and notice that again we have the woman and the Negro. Who's missing? So, mostly white women involved in the movement then began to form these informal groups, consciousness-raising groups, in which they, well, talked about their experiences of sexism in the movement. Through these consciousness-raising groups, they developed an understanding that they were not alone in their experiences of sexism. It wasn't just, you know, them, right? That their personal experiences were always being shaped by larger structures, and that therefore it was going to require collective political action to create change for women. Again, a couple of second wave feminist mantras here. Sisterhood is powerful and the personal is political. Again, getting at this idea that because women's problems aren't personal, they're political, the solutions must also be political. And that the solutions must be collective. Women cannot do it alone, they must act in concert with their sisters. And so here again, you see that notion of sisterhood rising to the forefront as it had in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. Wow. Okay. The second wave did a lot better than the first wave in terms of incorporating people other than middle-class white women in their group. As early as 1972, Ms. Magazine, I think this was actually in the first issue, ran an article by an African-American woman, Johnny Tillman, called "Welfare is a Women's Issue." She said, "I'm a woman, I'm a black woman, I'm a poor woman, I'm a fat woman, I'm a middle-aged woman, and I'm on welfare. In this country, if you're any one of those things, you count less as a human being. If you're all of those things, you don't count at all, except as a statistic. welfare is like a traffic accident. It can happen to anybody, but especially it happens to women. And that's why welfare is a women's issue. So here you can see Tillman joining class analysis and race analysis to gender analysis. This is Tillman here at a march at the National Welfare Rights Organization. Other groups of women, originally not excluded but marginalized, also demanded recognition and inclusion in the movement. One of the kind of classic texts of the 80s, I think it came out in 1987, is a collection of writings by people who called themselves radical women of color, called This Bridge Called My Back. And in particular, lesbians, women of color, and immigrants asserted their place in the movement and suggested that, in fact, their kind of multiplicity of identities gave them a unique perspective as outsiders, kind of multiple outsiders, right, being multiply marginalized, and that made them particularly perceptive critics of all forms of inequality. And therefore, white, middle-class, straight women in the movement needed them, right, because they could bring this perspective that was based on multiple forms of oppression, not just sort of one kind. I'm going to jump forward from the second wave to the third because we are almost out of time, and I meant to leave time for questions. But you can really see these kind of attempts, not necessarily totally successful attempts, but attempts to begin to come up with a more inclusive kind of activism that simultaneously acknowledged the demands of people of color and the demands of women in the so-called third wave, right? So feminism from the 1990s forward. One of the places that I personally saw this and where I first became convinced that there was actually something to this third wave business, because I'm a historian and I'm a little skeptical about making claims about things that are going on right now, right, was when I went to the March for Women's Lives in Washington, D.C. in 2005. The march is really an interesting thing because although a lot of it was about defending women's access to abortion and the original Supreme Court decision announcing the choice to have an abortion as a constitutional right, Roe v. Wade, and that's typically understood to be mostly white middle-class women's issue, right? And that was there, but there were a lot of other demands that really placed the needs and the concerns of African American women, immigrant women, young women, and poor women at the center, not at the margins, at the center of the conversation. So one of the demands was affordable quality health care in one's language of choice. This is about including recent immigrants, right? You can see here, derechos reproductivos son derechos humanos, reproductive rights are human rights. Comprehensive sex education, not abstinence only. This is about young women. Non-punitive welfare policies, no more child caps. This is about poor women and also women of color, who tended to be most likely to be targeted in these kinds of things. Ending the coercive sterilization of women of color. Well, that one's obvious. Ending the global gag rule. Extending the same rights that women in the United States have to women in all other countries. Emergency contraception, again, mostly directed at young women, and then legal abortion, right? Still mostly understood as an adult white women's issue, but it's only one of many here. So, not that I'm Nostradamus or anything, but my prediction, nonetheless, is that when the present day actually becomes history, and historians are looking back on the third wave of the movement. That one of the things they're going to say about the third wave is that it made a huge step forward in terms of overcoming the divisions that had characterized the first and second waves that required people to choose between prioritizing race or prioritizing gender. Because third wave feminists often espouse this notion of intersectionality, right? That we all exist at a point of intersection of our multiple kinds of identity, right? So you're not just a woman. You are a woman who is white or Native American or Latina or Korean, right? Or whatever, right? And you're not just that either. You're also maybe a mother or a sister or a grandmother or a daughter. And you're not just that. You're also straight or not, right? And you're also well-educated or not. And you're also privileged or not, right? All those things, right? All those things come together, and and every one of us exists at a point of intersection of multiple identities. So that you can't, if everyone exists at this point of intersection, you can't prioritize those, right? You can't say, well, I am all these things, and yet I am only going to identify as X, right? You're always all those things all at the same time. And when activists come to their work with that notion, it's a lot harder to pit different groups against each other and force people to prioritize and therefore sort of splinter and fragment the movement. So that is a very, very quick overview of the three waves and the ways in which they have intersected with, speaking of intersectionality, intersected with movements for racial justice to sort of a greater or lesser extent with more or less success. But I would suggest recently more. So thank you. I know many of you have to leave, so let's have a moment while everyone who has to leave leaves, and then if people want to ask questions, you can ask questions. And in the meantime, I will.
Nice to see you.
And for everybody who's leaving, next month, we are having Miss Juanita from the university come in, and she's going to speak about Hindu goddesses and female power. So that will be our next one on the series, yeah.
What was that? Hindu power? Hindu what?
Goddesses and female power. Yeah, and I think that'll be the third Friday of the month as well.
He's been doing well. He did, yes, yeah. He had a little moment where he...
So I put up the Y books in case anyone wants to copy down those titles. But is there anything that folks are just dying to talk about before you rush off to your next thing, since I know this is the middle of a work day? Yeah? How does the equal rights play into this? Yeah, really good question. And and had I had more time, I would have actually spent a lot of time, if I could have, talking about the Women's Conference in Houston in 1977, which was, on the one hand, kind of a scene of a lot of divisions with all of these different caucuses, you know, the Black Women's Caucus, the Asian Women's Caucus, the Lesbian Women's Caucus, the Radical Women's Caucus, right? Sort of all these different groups. But they ultimately came up with a list of demands, much like the list of demands with the March on Washington, with a list of demands that was very self-consciously, carefully crafted to be inclusive of many different groups, including, not limited to, but including women of color, housewives, and lesbians. So again, it was a subject of debate. Non-majority women definitely had to push to have their voices heard, but they were heard, and they did end up on the kind of official agenda that came out of that conference. Much more so, for instance, than at the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls, which you read the list, And really, most of those things don't mean beans to anybody. I mean, you know, right to divorce for slave women who don't have the right to marry. You know, access to the professions for women who are, you know, struggling to keep themselves and their families from starving. You know, I mean, not that those things aren't important, but they are privileged women's concerns to a much greater extent than non-privileged. So one of the things you can see is if you kind of look at these documents that come out of each wave and look at the demands and think about, okay, who are these demands most salient for? So the Houston 1977 document was a lot more inclusive. And it included the ERA, and it included abortion rights, but it also included things like, well, for you all, thank you. For you all, you'll probably want to know one of the things that it demanded was federal funding for local shelters for victims of gender-based violence. That was one of the specific demands, and that was in '77, and of course that's what VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, came from, eventually.
These things seem to take a lot of time sometimes.
Yes, they do. Yes, I think another lesson is not only that people have to work together, but that they have to be committed for the long haul.
Yeah. While you talked, I'm an Antioch College grad.
I thought I recognized you from some other lecture and that I'd heard you say something about Antioch, which is like the only place more radical than Oberlin.
Yes, absolutely. And still, we rescued the school. For those of you who don't know, Antioch got closed by Antioch College got closed by Antioch University, and the alumni bought it back.
Yeah, Antioch is also, for Ohio, I realize Ohio may sound very boring and Midwestern, but in the 1830s, Ohio was at the center of the burned over district, which was the part of the country where sort of millennialist, evangelical, perfectionist preaching had really made a major impact, right? The fires of that brand of religion had burned most fiercely. And that brand of religion was associated with abolitionism and all kinds of other cutting edge, sometimes strange things.
Antioch was the first school. It opened in 1854 with at least one black, and women on an equal basis, and the faculty women on an equal basis.
Yeah.
And Horace Mann was the founding president, said to the first graduating class, "Be ashamed to die till you've won some victory for humanity."
Oh, wow.
It runs our lives. And that includes Coretta King, it includes Rod Serling, and Stephen Jay Gould, and Eleanor Holmes Norton, who's the district's currently non-voting delegate in Congress.
Yeah.
Was there when we were there.
Yeah, it's a really, I mean, so.
Editor of Rolling Stone.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Ohio has this incredible collection of small liberal arts colleges that have a history of producing activists. I mean, all the way back to the 1830s, 40s, and 50s to the present. It's, again, I realize it may not sound like the Midwest, but the Midwest is not always boring.
And the first woman ordained as a minister, Universalist, was in the first graduating class.
Oh, Universalist. Yeah.
And of course, Horace Mann was a Unitarian.
Right. Yeah. Pretty cool stuff coming out of there.
And married to one of the Peabody sisters.
Oh, the Peabody sisters. Have you read the biography of them? Yeah?
Of course.
Okay. She's written a new one about Margaret Fuller that's really fascinating. I'm reading it right now. It's only in hardback. I can't remember what it's called, but, you know, Margaret Fuller, by the woman who wrote the Peabody sisters book. All right, yes, go ahead. One more thing and then I should really probably let you go.
It's something slightly more contemporary. I just wondered if you followed at all some of the fights that have been going on between arguably African American women, specifically around black women, and what you might call white the Miley Cyrus thing, and then his Beyonce feminist kind of argument back and forth.
The short answer is no. Clearly, I'm not super confident with technology. I'm also not terribly up to date on local media. So like the only reason I know who Beyonce is because they play her music at my gym. I mean, really. So yeah, that would be Beth Hubbell's area of specialty, but not mine.
I was just curious because what I find interesting about the discussions now is that they are using the exact same language that occurred during the second wave, which I recently learned from Dr. Hayden, and then it's kind of, though, I mean, the whole reason the birth of the third wave is to kind of change that rhetoric, and it doesn't seem to have occurred in large part.
Right. Well, I mean, of course, it's not like every other person on the street is saying, "Hi, I'm a third wave feminist, and I believe in intersectionality," and that means that it's important to work for justice for everyone all at the same time, and we should all work in coalition together, right? I mean, right? I mean, there are activists, and then there are not, right? But again, as what's your name?
Marjorie.
As Marjorie was saying, these changes sometimes take a really, really, really long time to come to fruition. And I mean, I guess I just find it encouraging that at least for the activists, the language is changing. I mean, if you compare you compare Elizabeth Cady Stanton, oh, well, here's a good one. So Susan B. Anthony saying, "I will cut off my right arm before I will give the vote to the Negro and not for a woman." Okay, right? And you compare that to third wave conversations about intersectionality. I mean, she was no more typical of her time than third wave feminists are of our time, but there's change.
Yeah.